I want to welcome everybody to the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Program Conversations on Democracy series. And we're focusing tonight on American foreign policy during the Biden presidency, challenges and opportunities. I'm Jean Garrison. I'm a professor in the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies here at the University of Wyoming. And I also direct the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Program. And this has been an opportunity to put together this program with two other partners, one of which is the Center for Global Studies here at the university, as well as the Office of Engagement and Outreach at the university. The Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Program Conversations on Democracy series provides an opportunity for UW and the broader community to engage in meaningful dialogues on a number of issues that are of interest to folks. Tonight, we're looking at the new president and looking at having a discussion about challenges and opportunities in the making of American foreign policy. We are joined by 5 experts with a lot of experience, both in the context of teaching and learning, but also practitioners of American foreign policy and international relations. And I will be introducing them as we go along, but let me just say a big thank you to all of you for being on this panel tonight. And I look forward to introducing you a little bit more formally when we get to, as we move through some prompts I'm going to provide for you for the discussion tonight. This event is also made possible by supporters of the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Program, and they include the Tucker Foundation, the Rocky Mountain Power Foundation, and our generous donors. So a big thank you to them. And I don't want to be remiss. I want to say thank you in particular to the Center for Global Studies, Kelly Hazlitt in particular, and at the Office of Engagement and Outreach, I want to thank Shelley Schneider for her assistance in getting the word out about this particular program. Also, Janine Jackson, who is our AmeriCorps volunteer with the Wallop Project and the Office of Engagement and Outreach. So we couldn't have a more fortuitous time to be talking about American foreign policy. It's always exciting when you have a new administration come in, and in many ways we have real differences between President Biden and the previous president, President Donald Trump. And there's no doubt that President Joe Biden enters office during turbulent times. Not only do he and the country face a global pandemic, America also faces new challenges around the globe as it seeks to deal with challenges such as Russia and China, and also a need to strengthen our alliances and allies, which are at a low point currently. Domestically, the United States is divided politically and faces major economic challenges. And part of our discussion tonight will be looking at how domestic factors influence foreign policy and vice versa. So just to give people a sense that this will be a very wide-ranging discussion. This is a distinguished panel of experts in international relations and foreign affairs, and they are coming to the questions we're posing tonight from a number of regional perspectives, as well as looking at things from a global perspective. They asked me to set the stage, so let me set the stage for a moment. So we have the election of Joe Biden, and in many ways, Joe Biden, it reminds me a little bit of George H.W. Bush in terms of having pretty deep experience in foreign policy. He was headed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has been vice president for 8 years in the Obama administration, and has really been active on the world stage. Maybe much like President Bush the Elder, he knew world leaders when he came into office, and we can say that is also the case with President Joe Biden. He has a relationship with many of the leaders around the world, and this is usually an advantage to have somebody who has that kind of experience. It's also rare. We have many presidents who don't have a lot of foreign policy experience. He gave his first major foreign policy speech last Thursday. He situated it at the State Department, which is a significant indicator that diplomacy is back. And he even said it that way. He said, America is back and diplomacy is back. He talked about America re-engaging with the world and used themes such as integrity, transparency, and accountability, and that America's foreign policy would be in service to the American people. And I think maybe our panelists will be addressing different aspects of that this evening. He is interested in promoting a foreign policy that promotes American interests, This is working with partners to restore democracy and human rights, habits of cooperation and alliances. He called out Burma in the speech that he gave last week, talked an awful lot about the importance of the democracies working together. He also talked about the power of our example and promotion of these values, that the values at home reflect foreign policy interests abroad. So a question I would have all of us think about tonight, and I want to welcome everybody from the campus and from the state, around the state and beyond, is this a watershed moment in American foreign policy? To what degree? What continuity and change do you see with President Biden and past presidents? And so how do other presidents and their records relate to the world that President Biden has inherited? So let me pose a question, which I'm going to put to Ambassador Mark Wall first. And that is, what general challenges and opportunities do you see for the new Biden presidency? What trends in the global environment will affect American policy, and what changes and similarities do you see in President Biden vis-a-vis President Trump and others? And by means of introduction, so everybody who is attending this session knows a little bit more about our distinguished panelist, Ambassador Mark Wall. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Chad, who has extensive experience as a foreign policy professional in Asia. His former appointments include Chief of the Economic Office, American Institute in Taiwan, and he has worked in the trade unit in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. He was involved in negotiations that led to China and Taiwan's accessions to the World Trade Organization, and has been active in organizations and negotiations involving the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization. I also want to note that he was our first senior visiting scholar in global studies here at the university. And so he taught on the campus here at UW for a year, about a decade ago now. So Mark, would you start us off, please?
I'll give it a try. It's a daunting assignment you've given us all, but thank you, Professor Garrison. And it's good to be with you all, even though it's virtual. I wish I could be there myself. I'm going to touch on one aspect of where I think this administration is going, and touch on some points where it contrasts with the previous ones. And I'll start out by just mentioning that on January 20th, at the inauguration itself, President Biden had almost nothing to say about foreign policy. But there was one point he did make, and that was, we will repair our alliances and engage in the world again. And then at the White House, just a few hours later, that afternoon, one of his first executive orders was for the U.S. to rejoin the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And he also signed a letter retracting the decision to pull out of the World Health Organization. And just the following day, Dr. Fauci was released to speak at the executive committee of the World Health Organization. So I think by President Biden's words and his actions in the first few hours in office, he was signaling that, I'll put it this way, the US was adjusting its approach to the world. The previous administration trumpeted a policy of America first. Biden and his foreign policy team, I think, believe that the best way of putting America first is by working with allies and by reestablishing the US position in international institutions. The way he put it in that speech at the State Department last week that Professor Garrison mentioned is this: it's in our own naked self-interest. When we strengthen our alliances, we amplify our power as well as our ability to disrupt threats before they reach our shores. Recently confirmed Secretary of State Blinken talks a lot about restoring American leadership. And he makes the point that the world doesn't organize itself. If the US is not engaged, others will try to take our place. Or, I mean, either way, U.S. interests aren't served. So I think, as mentioned, Blinken, like others on the new national security team, know President Biden very, very well. They've worked with each other and they've worked with President Biden very closely for a long, long time. Many are veterans of the Obama administration, and some had key roles in the Clinton administration. So they've been through this before. The thing is, the world hasn't stood still in the last 4 years, and they're finding, or soon will find, that exercising leadership isn't the same as it used to be. It's true that America's friends and allies, they're relieved, but they're also a bit anxious. They look at America and see a divided country that can't get a grip on the COVID pandemic or other social problems. They're worried about America's political dysfunction and wonder whether Donald Trump or someone like him could make a comeback. And they're still chafing under the tariffs the previous administration imposed on them. And they're not interested in joining a new Cold War struggle, pitting democracies against authoritarian states. Meanwhile, the issues Biden's new team will be facing, the rise of big power competitors, Iran's and North Korea's nuclear ambitions, the threat of pandemics and climate change. Those issues are even more challenging than when they held positions in Washington before. So President Biden said at that State Department speech that America's alliances are our greatest asset. But as much as our allies welcome the talk about America wanting to re-engage with them to address these challenges, we'll have to see how interested they really are in following America's lead, or what leadership might mean in this new environment. But still, it's very helpful to keep in mind something that Winston Churchill said about all this. There's only one thing worse than fighting with allies than fighting without allies. So alliance management won't be easy, but at least America does have allies. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. So I think people notice that there's a lot to talk about. So we're really setting a very broad landscape for what the opportunities and challenges are for the new administration. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Janine Jackson, who will be making some comments next. She is the former U.S. Ambassador to Malawi and Burkina Faso and a retired colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve. She has broad experience in development, governance, and security assistance programs, and she served as a diplomat in Switzerland, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, Kenya, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And actually several people on our panel served in Iraq at different points. But Ambassador Jackson, can I turn it over to you for a few minutes?
Thanks, Jean. I think I'd like to make several points on what I would like to refer to as the people part of foreign policy. President Biden addressed the State Department employees on February 4th before the foreign policy speech, and I think that symbolized his respect for national security professionals, which includes foreign service officers. I believe he will empower his national security team and hear their professional advice, to include those who offer different views. Secretary of State Blinken has indicated that open, creative, and uncensored dialogue among all players will be a part of foreign policy formulation. And President Biden talked about rebuilding the muscle of diplomacy. I expect more career professionals in key State Department positions. Under the last administration, no career diplomats served in the approximately 30 assistant secretary positions where policymaking and implementation takes place. Secretary Blinken will emphasize the long-held premise that foreign service officers must be nonpartisan. And I'd like to mention ambassadors. Ambassadors are appointed by the president, who draws from both the career foreign service and from the private or government sector. And the latter are known as political appointees. Many presidents have come under fire for appointing too many donors and friends. And the average portion of political appointees has hovered around 1/3. But under the last administration, 43% of ambassadors were political appointees, and many positions just remained vacant. I expect President Biden will move quickly to appoint an appropriate balance of career and political ambassadors. I saw a projection last week that 70% of his nominations could be career diplomats. And lastly, I'd like to mention that the State Department has a diversity gap. Only in five ambassadors were persons of color under the previous administration. Secretary Blinken is really committed to making the Foreign Service look more like America. Also, during the last 4 years, the State Department experienced the second highest attrition rate of federal employees throughout the federal government, and that's both foreign service and civil service. So it's going to take time to rebuild this professional service, while perhaps also emphasizing new skills such as global health, climate, and technology. And by the way, if there are any of you out there who desire a foreign service career, we for retired diplomats are certainly available to you for discussion. I'd like to mention one more thing, and that is the subject of linking foreign policy and domestic policy. President Biden said at the State Department that foreign policy success will be measured by impact on middle-class Americans. His head of the Domestic Policy Council is Susan Rice, and she was a former National Security Advisor as well as Assistant Secretary of State. So she will likely be the intersection between domestic and foreign policies on key issues, of which there are many, like pandemic response, cyber defense, extremism, climate, trade, and immigration. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think you brought back home to us that many in our audience might be interested in a foreign service career or a foreign policy career. And I just want to say that you all are great assets, and we thank you for your ongoing relationship that you've had with the University of Wyoming. And so sometimes opportunities, so there's an opportunity and a need to rebuild in the State Department, career professionals as well as others who are foreign policy professionals. But that means that there's opportunity, new opportunity for folks. Our next speaker is Ambassador Richard Holwell. He is the former U.S. Ambassador to Ecuador and is a foreign policy professional with extensive experience in international trade policy. He chairs a trade advisory committee for U.S. Trade Representative and the Asia Task Force at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I also want to note that he serves on the board of the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs. And everybody on our panel tonight has a connection to Wyoming. Let me turn it over to you, Ambassador Holwell.
Thank you, Professor Garrison. I am delighted to be part of this session tonight. And I want to pick up on something that Ambassador Jackson said. When Biden talked about making American foreign policy work for American families, he was actually addressing one of the Achilles heels of the Washington foreign policy establishment, which assumes that any reasonable person will see internationalism as necessary for America's self-interest. The last 4 years showed that it's very easy for nationalists to depict globalism as a giveaway to foreigners and a betrayal of average Americans. He's talking about, Biden is talking about making sure that diplomacy works for the middle class. I about a year ago, I read a paper produced by Jake Sullivan and Salman Ahmed for the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace. It was called A Foreign Policy for America's Middle Class. So what I expect from the Biden administration is a little bit of domestic public diplomacy, making sure that the American people fully understand why we are doing these things. I think Jake and Salman will be among those who go out and speak around the country. You might want to try to recruit them to Wyoming at some point. But that's very true. I think all of us who've served in the State Department are critically aware of the fact that if you don't have public support for policy, it's very hard to implement it properly. I worked a number of controversial programs in Latin America in the 80s when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for what is now called the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. And public objections to much of what we were doing complicated everything that we tried to do. They are all well aware of this, and I expect to see them making a serious outreach on foreign policy. I also note that a couple of experienced China hands didn't go into State Department. Kirk Campbell, who is nominally the author of the Pivot to Asia, has taken a position as Deputy National Security Advisor. And Laura Rosenberger, who was one of Blinken's special assistants in the Obama years, has gone to state as in a somewhat amorphous position. But for the last 4 years, Laura has been at the German Marshall Fund running a program that was digging into the misinformation coming out of Russia and China. She is very much an expert on that. So I expect to see Kurt and Laura making sure that the entire bureaucracy responds to the president's desire to have a coherent policy with regard to China and with regard to international disinformation, which, and of our foreign policy challenges, I'd list China and disinformation as two of the top ones. The third that I would list is global warming, which several people consider a prime cause of the war in Syria, and which is driving much of the migration out of Central America. Thank you, Jean.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next, we will hear from Ambassador Gary Grappo. He is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Middle East Studies at the Korbel School for International Studies at Denver University. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Oman. He has extensive foreign service career experience in the Middle East, including in Iraq. And previously, he was also a visiting senior scholar in global studies here at the University of Wyoming. And it's very nice to have you join us, Ambassador Grappo, and maybe you have an opportunity to fill in some gaps and to maybe highlight some things that people might have already mentioned.
Sure, Jane, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to participate in the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Series. It's a pleasure to be with you all and join the other panelists. Both you and Janine mentioned President Biden's statement about the United States being back in the diplomacy game, and that this is going to be sort of our lead approach to dealing with countries around the world. And for those who practice diplomacy around the world, they know that the effective practice of statecraft means reflecting America's core democratic values and a more inclusive notion of what is national good. And so I just want to take a few minutes to talk about President Biden's reference to democracy and human rights. Democracy and human rights hasn't always been at the core of US foreign policy. It was only with the Carter administration that we started talking seriously and inclusively about human rights in US foreign policy. Since then, however, we've broadened it to include democracy. It's been practiced, I'll admit, episodically from one administration to the other. and it's not always Democratic or always Republican. It's varied from one to the other. But for those practicing diplomacy abroad, they understand the importance that the example of America presents to the world, and not just our own democracy, the oldest in the world today, but also in promoting it, in advancing it, and supporting it around the world. And so it's very reassuring to hear President Biden talk about returning democracy and human rights to a core function of US foreign policy. And it couldn't come at a better time. We are now in a global democracy recession. It's been ongoing for the last 14 years. We've seen a steady decline in democracies over that period of time around the world. And we're talking about fairly substantial countries, including Brazil, India, Hungary, Venezuela, and Turkey. One of the ways that President Biden has talked about addressing this is calling a global democracy summit. And I'll be the first to tell you, when you call these big events, you got to be careful because you don't know what you're going to get. First of all, who are you going to invite? We have friends in the world who are not democracies. And of course, then there is the decision about who does the inviting. We have very good friends around the world who we want to be at that summit, and they should probably have a say in who gets invited. And thirdly, where is it held? When you hold major summits in this country, you better be ready, and especially in light of the events of the last few months. And so I'm not sure when or where the summit will be held, but I think it is important, and President Biden has said he wants to hold this early in his administration, that it is important to gather the world's democracies and demonstrate the importance of our democracies to ourselves and the importance of supporting one another and their democracies. I tell the students whom I teach that democracy is just not something you flip onto autopilot once you think you've got it. This requires constant management and engagement. It's a hands-on exercise, and even after nearly 250 years, we in this country still don't have it right. And so rather than preaching, I hope that at this summit, we will do a little more listening to our friends, colleagues, and allies around the world who are democracies and who are also struggling with a lot of the same issues we are here in this country. Now, why is it important to the American public that that American diplomats, the American president, be advocating on behalf of democracy and human rights? First of all, we're the largest democracy in the world and the most powerful democracy in the world. And countries, even countries that are not democracies, even countries that suffer oppression, and I've been told this personally, want to hear from us. Even if we know we can't force their governments to become a democracy, it's important to know that they have a large country, a powerful country like the United States, speaking on their behalf when they cannot. That's number one. Number two, democracies are inherently more stable. If you look across the world, the most prosperous, most developed countries in the world, in North America, in Europe, in East Asia, and in the Southwest Pacific, are democratic. Over 60% of global GDP is housed in democratic nations. Democracy is productive, it's effective, and it creates prosperous societies for the people who live there. It's in our interest to help forge more democracies around the world. And finally, democracies are inherently more stable. Democracies don't go to war with one another. We've had tremendous success since the Cold War, where you could count democracies on maybe 4 hands. Today, there are over 90 democracies, although the number has declined, as I said, over the last number of years. But we've had tremendous success, and the reason is because people around the world want democracies. In my own experience, in addressing the challenges of the Arab Spring, which erupted in the Middle East in 2011, when they talked to people demonstrating on the streets in Cairo, in Tunis, in Sana'a, in Yemen, in Damascus, in Tripoli. And you heard these people in the streets. They knew what democracy was capable of providing their of democratic populations, and they wanted it in their own. Now, in advocating democracy, we have to be humble. We can't change the world, but we can preach a strong message. We can call out countries. It's also important that Americans understand when we talk about democracy and human rights, we're also talking about fighting corruption. We're also talking about going after tax havens around the world. And that has a direct impact on American voters and American taxpayers. So it has a direct interest to the United States. And so I'm very encouraged to hear that Joe Biden is returning democracy and human rights to the center of US foreign policy. It's something that we have offered to the world. We are capable of doing it, and we should do it.
Thank you. Our next set of comments will be from Dr. Stephanie Anderson. She is a professor and head of the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies here at the University of Wyoming. Her expertise focuses on European security policy and the European Union more generally. She has been a senior fellow at the University of Basel in Switzerland, also with the Free University of Berlin, and has a lot of experience looking at EU policy, and we are currently working, I'm happy to say, on a joint project looking at US foreign policy. Dr. Anderson.
Thank you very much. So how much support will Joe Biden have publicly, domestically, for a more internationalist foreign policy? So I have just a few public opinion slides to show you. So if you can see this slide here, it shows how polarized the American public is. So if you are a Democrat, you're going to think that a Democratic president is doing a good job with the US position in the world. If you're a Republican, you're going to think that the Republican president is doing a good position or putting the US in a good position in the world. And so if you look here, you can see under Obama, we have Democrats are happy, Republicans are unhappy. And you see under Trump, Republicans are happy, Democrats are unhappy. So there's definitely, you can see how this is inverse to each other. Depending, your view of the world, of the United States and the world, depends on who's in power. And yet, if you look at this slide, it says that Americans in general, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, feel pretty good about an activist, internationalist United States. You can see here this top line. Basically, we have a low of, let's say, 54 and a high of 71 here, with an average in the 60s. About 60% of Americans, whether Republican or Democrat, think it's good for the United States to take an active part in the world today. Now we have Donald Trump, who tweeted that NATO is obsolete. Many Europeans thought he was very antagonistic to NATO. And yet, and this number, I'm sorry, this chart only goes to 2014, but these numbers are stable throughout the Trump presidency as well. We have about a 68% on average favorable view of NATO among Americans in general. For Republicans, it's their favorite international organization. So there's still a great deal of general support in the United States for among the public for these international institutions. So this is also a very telling slide. A majority say that good diplomacy is the best way to ensure peace. And they also say that allies' interests should be taken into account. So not so much American first, but actually consulting and working with allies. So overall, we've got 68% of Americans who say to take into account the interest of its allies, whereas only 31% to follow its own national interests. Now, this side is the majority for Republicans and Democrats, with the exception of conservative Republicans. And there it's 55-44. So a significant majority of conservative Republicans say no, but still a significant a number also agree with that. Overall, 68% is quite a high number. Good diplomacy, look at this, same except for the conservatives, conservative Republicans here, but Republican leaning and moderate to liberal Republicans, as well as Democrats. Overall, 73% would support good diplomacy. And that's all I have for right now. But I think it does give some hope, I would say, for Biden having popular support for his policies. And it also shows that despite Trump's America First, there has been a pretty steady line of support for an internationalist, activist American foreign policy in general over the past 50 years.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I just want to remind people that I am collecting questions in the Q&A function. I do see those, and I will moderate that discussion and present those questions to our panelists. And so please, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A function. I've got a second prompt, that second set of questions to pose to our panelists, and then I will open up and be addressing the questions that you are posing. Each of our panelists have significant experience in at least one region of the world. And so I wanted to pose to them what they saw as the particular opportunities and challenges for the new administration in a particular region. So they've been given kind of marching orders to cover certain parts of the world, and you're very welcome to comment on others. But I thought I would go ahead and go back to Ambassador Wall and say, you have a lot of experience in East Asia, a lot of experience in China. And what do you see in terms of the major challenges? And by the way, let's just admit that we're asking people to cover a huge geography here, but it'll be interesting to see how our regional challenges, how they intersect with the global themes that people have raised so far. So Ambassador Wall.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to focus in on China. We can talk generally about U.S.-Asia policy, but I really, my focus of what I want to tend to is China. I think it's no surprise that we find now that U.S.-China relations are at their lowest point since at least the Tiananmen massacres in Beijing, now more than 3 decades ago. But back then and in the years since, there was a broad appreciation in Washington, at least, of the strategic reasons for keeping the bilateral relationship on track. And for the most part, those in the most senior positions understood the stakes and knew how to manage the frictions. In my opinion, the last administration gets mixed marks in its China policy. It built on what the Obama administration was doing increasingly in its last year or two. The Trump administration did recognize the seriousness of the challenge that China was posing. Its policy of supporting a free and open Indo-Pacific, a sound strategy, though was undercut. It could have been much more effective if it hadn't been undercut by erratic execution, self-defeating trade war, and withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's though Beijing's own actions that have had most to do with the downturn in relations. It's become much more repressive, much more belligerent abroad. And this is a trend that's been building for a while, but it got much worse after Xi Jinping took over nearly a decade ago. But China's leadership is convinced that the United States is in a terminal decline and that China's day has come. But this kind of hubris has worked to alienate many of China's neighbors as well. China's been bullying them, and many are pushing back now. China recently has been cutting some deals with them to try to diffuse tensions. But I think it's fair to say that wolf warrior diplomacy is here to stay. Now, Beijing has been sending some signals to the new administration that it wants to turn over a new leaf. But if so, it's had a strange way of showing it. It's within days of the new administration, just before it came into office, they sanctioned a number of former US officials. They authorized the Chinese Coast Guard to fire on vessels in waters they claim in the South China Sea. And they've been sending fighter aircraft into Taiwan's airspace. The way the new administration, though, frames its China policy is in many ways not that much different from the way the previous one did. It sees China as the primary geopolitical threat. It casts the relationship in terms of a contest between a democratic model and an authoritarian model. But there is a real difference in tone. The incoming administration uses much less heated rhetoric. At Biden's first foreign policy speech at State Department the other day, he did call China our most serious competitor, but he didn't go out of his way to accuse the Chinese Communist Party of posing an existential threat to our interests or having global ambitions to extend its repressive system around the world. Now, there'll be some real differences, I think, in how the new administration deals with China. It's talked, as we've discussed already, it's talked about working more closely with their allies. So we'll see a strengthening in the exchanges with Australia, Japan, and India, the so-called Quad group. But there will also be steps to fortify our alliances with Japan and South Korea and more serious engagement in regional forums. As Gary mentioned, the administration wants to put more emphasis on promoting values. So I think we'll see more consistency in calling out China's human rights practices. And finally, the administration speaks about linking foreign policy to America's domestic economic renewal. So I think we'll see a drive to invest in cutting edge technologies and to counter China's mercantilist practices. And as much as the new administration does want to work in tandem with allies, the most recent investment deal between China and the European Union suggests that won't be so easy. And nor will US allies, as I mentioned before, be all that interested in taking part in an ideological struggle against China. Biden and his team speak about the US-China relationship as being competitive and even adversarial, but they're always careful to leave the door open to cooperating when our interests align. So climate change, global health, nuclear non-proliferation have been mentioned as examples. But I think the early signs in the administrations point to a harder edge prevailing. Jake Sullivan, the new National Security Council director, and Kurt Campbell, the White House's new Asia czar, wrote recently about how we should not be all that eager in seeking to cooperate on these transnational challenges, at least early on in the administration. So it's no surprise that Biden said in an interview the other day that he's been telling Xi Jinping that we need not have conflict, but there's going to be extreme competition. And he's already flagged that he won't be moving soon to relax the tariffs that are now in place against China. And in the same vein, Secretary Blinken has agreed that imprisoning 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang is tantamount to genocide. And I think it was a really telling signal that among the invited guests at the inauguration ceremonies was a woman named Bi-Khim Xiao, who was the head of Taiwan's representative office in Washington. I think we actually do have the risk of groupthink, though, setting in, because everyone in Washington agrees that we've that China's a threat and we've got to get tough. So we've got to watch out for a habit of blaming our own problems on the rest of the world and demonizing outsiders. Jake Sullivan and Kirk Campbell also have written about needing to achieve what they call a steady state of clear-eyed coexistence and to prevent a dangerous escalatory spiral, even as competition continues with China. I think that's a pretty good way to put it, but to manage that competition and keep that competition from leading to conflict, it's going to require not only very clear eyes, but also a very cool head.
Okay, thank you. So I want you all to know that we've got a slew of questions here. So maybe I can pose it. So we've kind of got to go around the landscape of the world. Your top two challenges. This is not fair. I can't say this because you're covering the continent of Africa here, Ambassador Jackson. But what do you see as kind of the common themes across the continent of Africa, or things that you would point to in particular as challenges or things that need America's attention?
Well, first of all, I'd like to mention that the US-Africa relationship has been characterized through multiple administrations by signature initiatives, and that being in health, education, governance, security, and economic growth. And so there's really no change to that. The former president didn't have much interest in Africa, but all of those, the longstanding policies and programs were generally maintained. And that is because of bipartisan support from Congress. So I think that the Biden administration will get bipartisan support from Congress continuing on his development agenda in Africa. But I think he will consider upgrading it to help confront 21st century challenges like climate change, insecurity, and global health. I think one of our challenges is in diplomacy, and President Biden already has a leg up. He spoke on February 4th to the African Union Leaders Summit, which seemed to me to be an indication that he does intend to pay attention to Africa. So expectations are pretty high, and I am projecting a balanced, robust, and respectful partnership with African nations. Gary mentioned democracy and human rights, and so many Africans are looking to, or have looked to, the United States as an example of a democracy. They want to live in a democracy, but events of January 6th here may have reduced our influence in driving that agenda. I think the best thing we can do for Africans is to demonstrate conviction of our own democratic values. The 54 African nations play an important role in the United Nations, and the new US ambassador, who used to be my boss, really knows the importance of engaging those countries to help manage international problems. Development assistance will be key to our policy with Africa. And I think the Biden administration sees development assistance as a foreign policy tool. African nations are really coming to grips with the fact that the pandemic has wiped out decades of gains in poverty reduction. So I think there will be bipartisan support for Africa to help African countries recover from the pandemic and regain the momentum of development goals. But of course, the highest priority will be supporting WHO and governments to vaccinate the continent. So when President Biden signed on to the COVAX agreement, Russia and the US were the holdouts. Now Russia is the only country that isn't signed on to ensuring that the world receives the COVID vaccine. It's the moral and scientifically right thing to do. I think that African youth are an issue. Their vast numbers are uneducated, unemployed, and disaffected. 55% don't even graduate from high school. So I think President Biden will continue President Obama's focus on youth And in Africa, it's important to address gender equality and protecting women's health and reproductive rights. And another issue that President Biden raised recently very strongly is his desire to lead on LGBTQ rights, which could be a point of disagreement with some Africans. And I think the most important thing we can do for Africa is see the continent of 1.2 billion people to be a huge consumer market. US trade and investment took a nosedive in the last few years and is 1/3 that of China. So I expect the Biden administration will actually build on a Trump administration initiative called Prosper Africa to encourage US businesses to invest and trade big in Africa. And the last point I'd like to make is has to do with security. Africa is the home to multiple transnational terrorist groups. I expect President Biden's interagency team to push for increased US security assistance to train and equip national forces so they can continue to participate in peacekeeping operations in Africa and also take the lead in the security of their own countries. And of course, the most complex challenge in Africa is how to reduce the influence of the Islamic fundamentalist non-state terrorist organizations. I expect the Biden administration to perhaps refine counterterrorism efforts and approach the issue multilaterally and try to address the economic, political, and social root causes of the conflicts, many of which are ethnic and regional infighting. That's all I have. Thanks.
I'm going to turn it over to you, Ambassador Holwell, and I'm going to pose a question though that I'm seeing in the chat, in the Q&A. I'm just reminding folks that if you have a question, please go ahead and put it into the Q&A. I am monitoring it. And you're going to be looking at Central and South America, some issues that you see is coming to the fore. But the question we have is a comment that President Biden didn't address international drug policy and its implications in the foreign relations with Central and South America in the recent speech. And so the question is, where do you see the president taking the drug war, especially in light of Vice President Harris's past agenda on drug war policy? So if you would kind of weave that question into the comments you already had prepared. Thank you.
You know, I didn't prepare anything on the drug war, but I probably should have. I will make a couple of general comments and then close with the drug war. But you have to look at things differently. Central America, the problem is economic stabilization. The ongoing drought has just devastated Honduras. The rise in temperatures has killed the coffee crop in Guatemala. This is what's causing much of the exodus. And indeed, if I would suggest that a graduate student might find an interesting project to look at the correlation between the drought, the fall in crops, and the rise in drugs and corruption in Honduras in particular. So economic stabilization in Central America, but in South America, the question is democracy, democracy, democracy. I have been closely following the election in Ecuador, and it is actually over the future of democracy. The leading candidate who led the polls last Sunday is a stalking horse for a caudillo who is now in exile in Belgium by the name of Rafael Correa. And the other two candidates, other two primary candidates, were basically campaigning on an opposition to Correa. So an interesting political candidate, Yaku Perez, an indigenous, indígena, they say down there, is going to be in a runoff with Aruz, who is the the stalking horse. And I think that when I talk to my friends in Ecuador, they're talking about this is an election about democracy. Switch to Bolivia. Evo Morales is not in power, but he's pulling the strings behind the power. Argentina, Fernanda Kirchner is pulling the strings. A Peronista is really running the show in Argentina. Bolsonaro in Brazil obviously has his authoritarian streak. And then you've got to deal with Maduro in Venezuela. I am encouraged that the Latin American democracies, plus a few from the Caribbean, have come together to form the Lima Group in an effort to try to moderate the policies in Caracas and try to support a democratic opposition there. I think the Biden administration is going to be well advised to work more closely with the Lima Group and not directly threaten Maduro with the threat of military intervention or regime change. That only helps him. Finally, I want to make one quick comment about Cuba. I had the Cuba account years ago. I've been to Cuba any number of times, including several times in the Obama administration. In truth, that's not a foreign policy problem. This is a domestic policy problem. Cuba is a barnacle of, our Cuban policy is a barnacle of the Cold War. What you have in Cuba is an unresolved civil war that needs some kind of intervention, possibly from the Pope, to bring Miami and Havana together. I hope the Obama administration can find a way to do that while easing sanctions on Cuba. But I don't want to do it too quickly because Cuba is on the verge of doing major economic reforms that it badly needs for its own benefit. And I was in a call this morning with the new Cuban ambassador to the United States, and she indicated they are absolutely determined to go forward with these reforms. But the last time they got this close, Obama eased sanctions, the tourist business picked up, and they said, well, no, we can keep going with all these other things that we're doing. So democracy, 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 economic stabilization, and a little bit of reality in Cuba. And I'm going to be as quick as I can because I see I see 17 questions in the queue, and I'd like to see what they've got to say.
I would invite anybody on the panel you can go ahead and look at some of the questions if you'd like. I'll just say, Ambassador Grappo, many of them focus on the Middle East. And I know you have some set comments, but if you would, as you are, maybe weave in some discussion about kind of dovetailing off of your focus on democracy and the importance or the central nature of democracy promotion. What does democracy promotion look like in the Middle East? That's one of the questions that's been posed. And then looking at, here's another one I'll provide, and that is the previous administration took the Middle East as one of its main areas of involvement and presumed achievement. What do you consider the likely next steps in the region for the Biden administration? And I think that question sets up your comments quite a bit. Turn it over to you.
Yes, it sure does. Both of them, Gene. I think we will see a rather historic departure on the part of this administration when it comes to the Middle East from administrations going back to perhaps even as far back as Harry Truman. Middle East issues are not going to be top issues for the Biden administration, with the exception of one case only. And it's the number 1, 2, and 3 priority for this administration, and that's Iran. And it's going to be a very fine line for this administration to walk, and a very challenging one, both domestically as well as internationally. It's a confounding, complex, and difficult issue simply because there's so much hatred and animus and distrust between these two countries on both sides. I will say that with respect to the rest of the Middle East, the challenge is going to be to manage the drawdown of America's military presence throughout the Middle East and stepping up our diplomatic presence while maintaining the influence throughout the region that we have. the United States is still the dominant player in the Middle East, but it's not the player that it was 10 or 20 years ago. We have other competitors now. Iran is a competitor, of course. Turkey is a competitor, and Turkey used to be an ally. Now we're not quite so sure. And of course, Russia and China are now very much present throughout the Middle East. Everything from influencing and pressuring governments to selling weapons and buying a lot more oil from that part of the world than the United States is. And so we have to understand that there's going to be competition for influence, but we're still the dominant player. And many of the countries in that region remain pretty strong American allies. But Iran is the main challenge for this administration. The president has said he wants to rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and I think he plans to do it, but he made very clear the other day that he's not going to take any action until Iran returns to compliance with the JCPOA. That is shutting down some of the increased centrifuges that it's started and reducing its stockpile of enriched uranium, and also stop enriching uranium beyond the 3.57%. Iran announced several weeks ago that it's going to be enriching uranium at 20%, which it had been doing prior to the 2015 JCPOA accord. And then we have other issues that are going to have to be addressed. They are unavoidable for the United States and its allies. The first is, of course, the time horizons that apply to Iran's nuclear development program. Many people in this country, and I'm not talking just Republicans, many Democrats feel that the time horizons are too brief. One is already expired back last fall. The next one comes up in 2023, and then we begin to see in 23, 25, and 30 significant ends to these time horizons. The United States cannot live with those any longer. So any return to the JCPOA is going to be transitional to something beyond that, and it's going to require pushing out many of those time horizons. The other major concern for the United States and our allies is Iran's behavior throughout the region. It's meddling in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. Its support for extremist groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and many militias, particularly the militias now fighting in Iraq and in Syria. There's going to be a lot of resistance from the Iranian government to include those, but President Biden and his negotiators are going to have to make it very, very clear. There is just no way the United States can engage in a long-term settlement, not just the nuclear issue, but these other issues without Iran agreeing to address those. So perhaps a transitional period where both sides in a stepwise fashion return to the JCPOA, but with a very express understanding, we're going to move on to the longer term issues of long-term nuclear weapons development and the question of Iran's engagement and involvement elsewhere in the region. Now, three things President Biden has to deal with that the Iranians do not. First of all, he's going to have to work very closely with our P5+1 partners. These are the other non-Iranian signatories to the JCPOA: Russia, China, and particularly France, Britain, and Germany. The latter three, who are our allies, are probably going to run interference for us initially before we're ever able to sit down with the Iranians. And we have to have them join us. That is, those three at the very least, before we can begin to make headway with the Iranians. Secondly, we're going to have to work much more closely with our regional allies. I'm talking here specifically of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. They believe they have vested interests. They claim existential interest with some validity in the outcome of these negotiations, and therefore they will have to be a part in some way, perhaps not directly, but they are going to have to be a part in a way they were not before when President Obama and his team negotiated the JCPOA. And finally, perhaps the heaviest lift for the president is he's going to have Congress on his side. President Obama did not. And it was a fatal mistake on the part of the Biden administration. I wish he had learned from Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. You don't negotiate agreements without bringing Congress on board. And I think Joe Biden has enough experience in the Congress, and he understands the need to bring the Congress along all the way. And then he needs to reach out to the Iranians, through his negotiators, and make it clear to them that if they truly want to finally enter into an enduring agreement with the United States and these other countries on these issues, that you're going to have the rest of the P5+1 on board. You're going to have the regional countries on board, and the American Congress is going to have to, even if not directly, and I don't think he'll submit it as he would a treaty for congressional approval, but he has to have the implicit approval of members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate. If he can't do any one of those three, there's not going to be a deal, or at least not a very successful one that'll last beyond his administration and up to the next Republican administration. On democracy, I will just say a few words that as important as I believe this is, democracy is going to be extremely challenging in this part of the world. Unfortunately, most of the governments in the Arab world learned very few of the lessons of the Arab Spring. Tunisia is the only success story. They now have a democracy, albeit a very challenged and troubled one. But the other countries effectively doubled down on what they have been doing over the last 70 or 80 years since World War II. They clamp down, they become more repressive, fewer rights, more people jailed, more people disappearing, fewer freedoms, more refugees. And unless those governments have a change in attitude and become more open and more receptive to the kinds of components of a democracy that their people want, transparency, accountability, rule of law, and so forth, they're going to be facing another Arab Spring. The only thing preventing it now is the pandemic. We saw just before the pandemic struck almost an Arab Spring 2.0 erupting in Lebanon, Algeria, Sudan, even in Iran, probably some of the worst demonstrations Iran has seen since the 1979 revolution. All of those are going to be coming back in full force once these countries manage to come to grips with the pandemic, presumably through vaccines. And that's going to be the action forcing event on democracy in this part of the world. The United States can encourage it, can promote it. We can provide help when we're asked. No more imposing democracies. But in fact, the toughest decisions are going to have to be made by the leaders and the people in those countries.
Thank you. For our final set of comments about a region of the world, we have very much a traditional transatlantic focus to foreign policy over the last 70 years. And I wonder, Dr. Anderson, if you wouldn't talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities you see vis-a-vis the United States and Europe, and maybe comment specifically about NATO and that alliance structure for the United States.
Oh, well, the Europeans just hated Donald Trump, and they are absolutely thrilled to have Biden in. And I'm going to speak for very briefly, but I'll just show a few slides because a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is the Time magazine of Germany. And it says here, this is from the 2016 election. It says insanity under Trump, and Hillary Clinton, her mission is to save the world from Donald Trump. If you look here, how would Europeans feel if Trump won versus Clinton? Afraid, disappointed, sad, versus relieved, optimistic, happy. Over here, you can see what happened in terms of public opinion. Under Bush with the Iraq War, it went down. Under Obama, went up. They really liked Obama. It was Obama mania. And then it went down under Trump. The good news is, in terms of European-American transatlantic relations, is that the Europeans blamed Trump more than the United States. So if you see this poll, it says 64% do not have confidence in Trump, but they do have still favorable, a majority have a favorable view of the United States. When it came to Biden versus Trump, it was really the same thing in the last election. The Europeans, you can see here, Denmark, Germany, Spain, Sweden, France, UK, Italy, huge numbers wanted Biden to win. And so it's not a surprise that the EU sighed with relief when Biden came into the White House. And I think what's really most telling is this last slide here. Bush goes down, up for Obama, down Trump. Really, look at this. Within a couple of weeks of Biden being president, it shot up to 79% approval, confidence, 72% and 65% in the UK. So this bodes very well for transatlantic relations. NATO, really the NATO problem with getting the Europeans to pay more has been an issue under every president, honestly. You go back to Kennedy with the dumbbell, trying to get them to be equal on the European side as with the American side. So that hasn't changed, but relations are so much better because the Europeans prefer Biden so much more that there'll be a bit of a renaissance, I think, with NATO. Certainly a sigh of relief that NATO is, the Americans will keep to their NATO commitments. And I think that will, the Europeans have said that they've learned their lesson from America with Trump, and they're going to build a stronger and more independent defense policy. I'm really skeptical of that. The Europeans don't have a lot of money right now. Money is always tight anyway, let alone with COVID. That's really put defense on the back burner. And I think they're so thrilled to have Biden in the White House that they're going to be much more likely to follow the American lead in this area. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So we have a string of questions on China. And I'm just going to synopsize them, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes, Ambassador Wall, and I'm going to give a minute or two to Ambassador Holwell as well. And let me just kind of phrase them for people very generally. There's a question about how would you advise the administration with respect to protecting democracy in Taiwan? There is another one looking at specifically commenting, Ambassador Wall, you disagree with the trade war, then how should the US rein in China, especially with not much support from the EU because of the new trade deal? There is another one focused on China, looking at, focusing on your comments, Ambassador Wall, on China's ambitious view of their role in the world. What specific country in the Indo-Pacific region are you worried about most? Or do you have other worries other than China, I guess is the way I might phrase that one. And then there's a question about what do you think President Biden might do about the coup in Burma, Myanmar? So I'm going to give you a minute or so, Ambassador Wall, then I'll turn it over to Ambassador Holwell.
To address all those questions?
Well, pick one or two, and then we'll leave the rest for cleanup. I think
Okay.
maybe the new questions. Maybe I paired the question on trade to both of you because of your backgrounds. So because I think that this administration has really said that, and your comments indicate that being involved in multilateral institutions like the Trans-Pacific Partnership are important for American foreign policy interests and promotion of them. So maybe comment on that, and then maybe you've already commented on the China challenge, I think, but maybe stick to that.
Right. Okay, I'll be real quick. Okay, Taiwan, let's not improvise. Let's stick to the one China policy. Let's reaffirm our support for Taiwan's autonomy, but don't use Taiwan to stick our finger in Beijing's eye. This is too dangerous. It's too much of a flashpoint. The current leader of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, I used to work with her when I was there. She's seen as a pro-independence leader, but she's very, very shrewd, very smart, very cautious. Let's not get too clever about this. Let's see, trade wars. We need to get firm, tough with China on its trade practices, but tariffs are a lousy way of doing it. They haven't worked. they've hurt us probably more than they've hurt China. It's hurt us in all kinds of ways. And it's very expensive to try to bail out the farmers who are subject to the retaliation that China has levied. The most effective way to do it is to address don't do it through these cosmetic trade deals, where China commits to buying a lot of American products. That has not worked. Address the structural issues. We've been trying to do this for a long, long time, but do it with our partners, because the issues that we have with China are the same issues that Australia has, that the Europeans have. We've got, instead of antagonizing our friends in dealing with China, we've got to do our best to work together. Now, that investment agreement the EU has worked out, it's going to complicate matters. I mean, Europe does have its own interests. Germany is much more dependent on China trade than others. So working that out is going to be tough, but that's what diplomacy is all about. And we've got to work to the extent we can through internationally, through the World Trade Organization. We've kind of walked away from that, but there are levers that we can use in the WTO. If we were in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we'd have we'd be part of another model for how to deal with trade, and it would be a much more it would be an incentive for greater trade promotion and liberalization through the region. Let's see, Burma, we can let the Burmese people know where our heart is, that we're with them. When coups like this happen, the US government is by law required to take certain actions, and we're doing that. We need to look at what kind of targeted sanctions we can take. But ultimately, work with our allies on a coordinated response. But ultimately, this is going to be something the Burmese people are going to have to work out. There was a question that I want to very quickly comment on, and that's what the impact of what happened in Washington on January 6th has been on our foreign policy. It's had a bad impact. China has played this to the hilt. It's shown the protest that took place in the Hong Kong Parliament and compared it to the ransacking of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. This is a reason not just for them to show that America is in decline. They think America's fallen flat on its face. But it's up to us now to get our act together. If we can come out of this and show that we're no longer, we're not a country at war with ourselves, that we can really adopt policies that will address some of our social problems, get our economy back going. That'll be the biggest message we can send about U.S. resiliency and how positive the American model can be. We've been through this before. We can get through it again.
Mm-hmm.
There we
Professor
go.
Holwell?
I agree with everything that Mark has said, but I want to emphasize one particular point. The Trump administration gutted the World Trade Organization. They shut down the appellate body. Now, the appellate body needs reform, but it needs to be reconstituted and it needs to work. We have to recognize that if we want China to obey the World Trade Organization protocols and rules, we must do so as well. And under Trump, we violated dozens of those rules and are paying for it. The grand lie that China paid the tariffs is still believed by many people. But let me tell you a quick story. I, through a friend, did some work for a Navy SEAL who's retired in Corpus Christi, Texas. He builds regulators for scuba equipment, but he got a subcontract from 3M to build some of the components for the ventilators being used to fight COVID. He had to import some of the key products from China. To get them, he had to pay a 25% tariff. China didn't pay it. He didn't have any alternative supplier to go to. He had to pay it. 3M had to pay it, and the hospitals that bought those ventilators paid it. We are the ones who pay the tariffs when we impose them on other people. There's a question in the queue that is addressed to me about how do you go about changing public opinion on foreign policy? But let me apply it now to trade policy. One of the problems is that most local news outlets do not carry any foreign policy stories, or if they do, they're syndicated and buried in the back of the page, buried in the middle of the newspaper without much fanfare. Meanwhile, some of the advocacy news programs that come on late at night or in prime time are beating the drum about false narratives regarding trade, regarding foreign policy, and any number of other subjects. One of the things that I have advocated is going to the hometown papers, the papers that you've got a member of Congress whose vote you need. You have to explain to the editors at his paper or the broadcasters in his region why what you want is in the interest of those constituents. We've done this in the past. It is not illegal. It is illegal to lobby, but it's not illegal to educate. I mean, it is illegal for the State Department to lobby, but it's not illegal to educate. And you've got to go beyond you got to go beyond Fox News and the other propaganda outlets and get real information to local journalists. That is one of the key things that you need to do to change opinions.
There's actually, I'm going to invite everybody on the panel to maybe flip through the questions in the Q&A to see if there's one that you want to address specifically as a final comment. But I want to pose one and ask maybe one or two people to respond to while the others do that. That is, there's a question that underlying this is what, there's a lot of polarization in the United States. There was a question about elections, and we have what happens to American foreign policy and unity in American foreign policy when you have administrations flip from one party to another. Well, I think more broadly, the question is, what about the deeply polarized American context and developing that kind of support for American foreign policy goals for a president like Biden? Dr. Anderson pointed out that in general, there's a lot of a lot of support for, engagement and diplomacy. But what do we do in the context of a polarized public? Who would like to address that? Ambassador Grappo, did you want to address this one, maybe?
Look, one of the advantages of our country is that all the problems that we have are broadcast worldwide, and all of the other panelists have probably had experiences meeting with foreign audiences who understand our problems sometimes better than many Americans do. And I know I have many times. I've been sometimes shocked at how well informed many foreigners are, for example, during a presidential campaign, and the subtleties and maybe not so subtle differences in the political positions of the candidates. I've always liked to turn this question around and say this is the advantage of a free society, that information is made available today increasingly, overwhelmingly, because of social media, and as Richard correctly pointed out, a lot of misinformation, purposely misinformation. And so, but it creates problems and doubts among our friends and allies around the world, and even among some of our adversaries, about the permanence of US policy and even American democracy. And as I said at my opening remarks about democracy, there's nothing guaranteed about democracy. There's nothing permanent about it. There's nothing written that says you get democracy and you're home free. You got it for all time. And I think we just need to make it clear that this is not only a struggle for ourselves, or for countries around the world, but we've been through all kinds of many challenges before and managed to emerge successfully, and more often than not, better for it. And I think harping on that theme, that we are going through a trying time. It's not unusual, and we will find a way in a democratic system that could not be done in an undemocratic system. And people can take hope from that and maybe some inspiration about the viability of democracy writ large, as well as democracy in this country. Secondly, I will say that America has a huge stock of goodwill around the world. There's many people are great admirers. They may differ and even argue very strenuously about certain policies of the United States. I know when I was in the Middle East, I heard it all when it came to our invasion of Iraq, to some of our oversights on preaching or on advocating on behalf of human rights in the Middle East. And nevertheless, they look to the United States, and they want to look to the United States, because we got a lot of power, both economic and military and cultural power, but generally because they know Americans, not always our American government, but Americans genuinely are passionate about our democratic system. And it's one that many of whose elements they hope to emulate in their own countries, even if they don't have democracies. Others may have comments as well, Gene. I just want to say there was one gentleman there that had a comment about Syria, and I'm happy to do that, perhaps when others have maybe weighed in with their thoughts.
I'm gonna pose a question, and I'm gonna turn next to Ambassador Jackson for some final thoughts on anything she wants to address from the Q&A or from what other panelists have raised, and just say that we have had one question about the nature of international student applications, that they've actually gone up 10% since last year. And what can we do as a campus to continue to engage with prospective students in the countries that you have served in? So if anybody wants to come back to that question, that would be appreciated. After all, that's something that universities can have an influence and direct role in for internationalization. Ambassador Jackson.
There was a question about what can we see in foreign aid or development assistance. And I'll just say one thing about that. Over the last 4 years, the Trump administration really cut the foreign assistance budgets, and inevitably the Congress reinstated what the Foreign Affairs Committee organizations were requesting. So there's bipartisan support in the Congress for foreign assistance. And I'd like to remind everybody that foreign assistance, development assistance, the budget is less than 1% of the US budget. So it does a lot of good for that 1%. On students, interesting that you mentioned that. As ambassador to Malawi, I had the opportunity to find scholarships for Malawians to study in the United States. And if you look back over the years, many foreign leaders were students in the United States. They picked up democratic values, the work ethic, the volunteer ethic that Americans have. And that has served us well. But suddenly, over some years, there's been a decline in getting students to the United States. And I'll tell you where the African students are going. They're going to China. The Chinese ambassador had 100 scholarships for my 10. So I think it would serve the United States very well if the private sector, as well as the public sector and educational institutions, really focused on drawing international students to the United States, as well as perhaps partnering with institutions overseas and helping especially in the developing countries, help build their educational institutions.
Dr. Anderson, final thoughts.
Well, my final thoughts is going to be to plug the next Wallop event. So I'll just share the screen briefly. We have next Friday on February 19th, we have Professors Jim King and Andrew Garner, and they'll be talking about the Capitol riots in perspective, institutions, polarization, and impeachment. So I'll hope you'll all tune in for that. I'll put this up on social media, and I know the Wallop will too. And thank you all so much. It's been a great pleasure to be here.
Okay, Ambassador Holwell, final thoughts.
It's been delightful. I'm glad I was able to participate. One question that I saw on the Q&A section was about Bill Burns, who's going to be the head of CIA. The thing you want out of your intelligence community is honesty, integrity, and truth-telling. I know no one better for CIA than Bill Burns. I'm willing to bet my colleagues agree.
Ambassador Wall, final thoughts?
I think the best way we can re-engage in the world is to get our act together at home.
Ambassador Grappo?
Just picking up on the comments of Richard and Janine with regard to Richard, I had the great good fortune to work closely with Bill Burns in the State Department for a number of years. I've known him for quite some time. There's just no one in the international foreign policy community that's more highly respected than Bill, and he will do a superb job over at the CIA, another institution that I respect enormously. Piggybacking on Janine's comments about international education, as ambassador, I love to talk about education in the United States. It was the easiest sell I ever had as an American ambassador, regardless of how emotional and difficult and challenging foreign policy discussions were with either foreign officials or foreign publics. When it turned to American education, they all loved us. They all want to come here. They all love studying at our universities, not because they're excellent universities where they can get terrific educations, but they get to live in America for 4 years, 6 years, or whatever it was. And wherever I've been around the world, from Central America to Europe to even Russia, and of course, throughout the Middle East, I've had so many people come up to me and talk about all the wonderful memories they have of having studied in America. For Americans, it's important to understand that every single one of those almost comes paying full freight. They pay full tuition. Now, I know scholarships are available from governments and so forth, but the vast majority pay their way. And last I heard, foreign students in the United States contribute about $50 billion to the US economy outside of tuition and books. It's something to keep in mind. And we're still the #1 desired location or country in the world for education. And it's probably one of the most powerful tools we have in our foreign policy toolkit. Just lastly, I will say that I don't know how many times I've met with cabinets or senior members of a particular ministry in foreign countries, and I've been astonished at how many studied in the United States. In the case of Jordan, at one time, 19 of the 21 cabinet members had US university degrees. The other 2 went to the American University of Beirut, which is pretty much an American university just in the Middle East. In Saudi Arabia, there are over 100,000 US university graduates, both undergraduate and graduate, in Saudi Arabia. So we had tremendous clout in a country with whom we have a very special and, of course, today challenging relationship. So I would just simply say that I'm glad to see that President Biden is going to open up again our student visas and make us a more welcoming country for students wanting to study here.
So I have to say that we had a high of 102 people as attendees in our webinar and our discussion tonight. And I think that's fantastic. And a lot of students and a lot of people from around Wyoming and some outside of Wyoming. There are some questions there that unfortunately we weren't able to pose to you. I did have a question from a couple of students about how they might follow up if they wanted to ask one of you a particular question. And I would just say to people, if you have a follow-up question that you'd like posed to folks on the panel, you can send an email directly to wallop@uwyo.edu and we'll field that for you and try to get your questions answered. I think what we have here is an indication that maybe we should come back and have another conversation about American foreign policy after we're in a few months and see when we can speak to some specifics. And I want to thank all of you for participating. I do want to emphasize that I hope everybody can be part of our panel discussion next week, actually Friday, the one that Dr. Anderson shared. And on behalf of our partners here at the University of Wyoming, the Wallop Civic Engagement Program, the Center for Global Studies, and the Office of Engagement and Outreach, and then just by our affiliation for Dr. Anderson and myself, the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies. Thank you for being with us this evening. Thank all of you out there in our audience for being part of this discussion. And I think there's a lot of interest. We will continue the dialogue and make sure all of you are invited to it again. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.